Philip Reid Saves the Statue of Freedom by Stephen Sellers Lapham and Eugene Walton, illustrated by R. Gregory Christie. Philip learned how things work from Jim, an old man. Jim showed young Philip how clay softens as you add water and work it with your hands, how wax and metal soften with heat, how wood cuts more easily after it is dried for a year in the sun. Jim learned these things as a boy in West Africa, where Yoruba artisans were famous for their skill in casting brass statuettes and fancy gold jewelry. Jim is now enslaved in the United States. Philip was born into American slavery before the Civil War. Philip learned about people from his mother, Betsy. One day, when he was 10 years old, she said, "We are enslaved, but even so, there is a moment for speaking the truth." Betsy also advised him, "Be patient. On this earth, all things change. One day, slavery will end. Then you will be a free man." Philip lived on a plantation near Charleston, South Carolina. He worked with the craftsmen who did jobs in the big yard. He pumped the bellows for the blacksmith. He stoked the kiln when the potter fired clay jugs. As he worked, he watched and learned. One day, a craftsman named Clark Mills came to create fancy plaster molding on the walls and ceilings of the master's home. Philip was excited to help Mr. Mills mix the plaster, and he held the ladder steady as Mills worked. When the week ended, Mills told Philip's master, "I need a skilled slave to be my assistant. What price would you ask for Philip?" When Philip left with Mr. Mills, Philip's mother sadly sang him a farewell song. Clark Mills moved to Washington, D.C., where he became a famous sculptor. In Mills's foundry, Philip helped to cast large objects in bronze. There were many steps in the process. Philip became skilled at repairing breaks in the plaster models and making the plaster molds that would hold the liquid bronze. It was always exciting when the day arrived for foundry workers to pour hot, molten bronze into the mold to create the statue. Philip was in charge of controlling the fire to melt the copper and tin, metals that make bronze. The pour was a dangerous and magical moment. Any flaw in the materials, any mistake in the movements of the workers could cause an accident. The liquid bronze glowed with its own inner light. It moved like an orange tiger as it flowed into the mold. The United States government hired Mills to cast a statue called Freedom in bronze. It would stand atop the new dome of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. One day in 1859, Clark Mills and Philip Reid traveled to the Capitol to fetch the plaster model for the statue Freedom. 4 wagons were filled with straw to cushion the 5 large sections of the model. Mills and Reid entered the room where the plaster model was on exhibit. It was framed by a scaffold. But something was wrong. About 10 men were gathered around the plaster model of the statue, looking at it and talking. An Italian craftsman had put the 5 big sections of the plaster model together. He covered up the seams with plaster, and now nobody could see where the seams were. The craftsman would not tell how to take the model apart for transport to the foundry. He wanted more money to finish the job. "Only I can do it," the craftsman asserted. "If you try, it will break." How could anybody else find the places where the 5 sections of the plaster model fit together? The seams were hidden with white plaster, just like icing hides layers of a cake. None of the other men in the room could solve the problem. They were afraid. If they made a wrong move, the plaster model might crack badly. If that happened, thousands of dollars would be wasted. The Capitol dome might not have a statue at its peak for many years. There was an uneasy silence in the room. Clark Mills stepped forward and said, "My assistant, Philip Reid, can solve this puzzle." The chief engineer looked doubtfully at Philip. "Can you do this?" he asked. Philip quickly studied the problem. Then he turned to the engineer and said, "Yes, I believe that I can." Philip knew a lot about plaster from his years of experience working in the foundry. He knew how much force it takes to break it and how to keep it from breaking. Philip worked slowly and carefully. He climbed to the top of the scaffold. He told the workers below to pull carefully on the ropes. Ropes and pulleys were attached to an iron hook embedded in the top of the statue. "Pull 1 arm's length," he said, "and then hold the rope steady. Ready? Heave! Ho!" The workers pulled, but there was no sign of a seam in the plaster mold. Philip called again, "Heave! Ho!" The workers pulled another arm's length of rope. The rope strained, and suddenly, yes! Philip noticed something. There was a seam running along the top of the shoulders. Now Philip could see where the top section was attached to the section below it. He could also see the faint outline of the flat, round head of a bolt. Using a tool, he loosened and removed it. Then he moved to the next bolt around the linear seam and removed it, then the next. Philip had to work slowly. Everybody watched, but nobody asked him what he was doing. Philip was already earning their respect. Finally, all of the bolts were removed. All that was needed was a bit more upward force. "This time, pull 2 arms lengths," Philip said to the workmen. "Heave! Ho! Heave! Ho!" The men handling the ropes pulled. Suddenly, the top section, head, neck, and shoulders, lifted cleanly away. The onlookers gasped. Philip peered inside the plaster model. Looking down, he could see the next row of bolts. One by one, he loosened and removed those bolts. Section by section, he worked. In less than an hour, 5 plaster sections sat separately side by side on the floor. Philip Reid had solved the puzzle. Everyone in the room sensed that something special had happened. The Italian craftsman left the room angrily. Everyone else was glad that the plaster model had not broken. Philip Reid had discovered how to take the plaster model apart. The work could go on. Philip was very pleased with his accomplishment. He remembered the words of his mother and Jim, encouraging him every step of the way. Looking over the 5 sections of the model laying side by side on the floor, Philip knew in his heart that he had just achieved a high goal, and he felt grateful. It took 2 years to create the bronze statue of freedom. Philip controlled the fires in the foundry. The work continued, even on Sundays, when everybody, slaves and masters, usually rested. The United States government paid Philip for his work on Sundays during the casting of freedom. For Philip, this was a taste of the true freedom to come. The Civil War had started. Freedom seemed just around the corner for Philip and all enslaved Americans. And it was.